Patient in the last couple weeks have been, and not couple weeks, the last two workshops in the last couple months. So we're going to get started in just a second as we have a couple people joining us here. As they still come in, if what you hear is interesting to you, after the workshop today, I went on eBay, which is a great place to buy used books that are out of print. And I bought 3 small biographies, they're the same, of Paul Tillich, about who his general thought and kind of impact. And then I also picked up a few of his better-known works. So The Courage to Be, Dynamics of Faith, and Theology of Culture. So if what you hear today is interesting to you, and you would like to borrow one of these, I'd be happy to lend it to you. I bought these for that purpose. So there we are. So Paul Tillich. I have to be honest, when I was in seminary at the start of this century, Paul Tillich was no longer a main voice in who we studied. But if you back up into the 50s, for example, Paul Tillich is one of the most influential theologians of the mid-20th century. And so Paul Tillich's thought influenced a whole generation of pastors who were retiring about the time that I started. Today would have been my father's 77th birthday, and Paul Tillich was his favorite theologian. So I thought, as we looked at it and I saw the dates, I thought, December 19th, I want to explore this essay. Now, Dad passed down a few of Paul Tillich's major theological tomes, his 3-volume systematic theology. I have to admit that I haven't gotten through all of the more academic works that I have of his, but an incredibly powerful short essay called You Are Accepted. I think this essay is quite grand, so I thought we could use it to study today, to talk a little bit about some of the concepts it brings up. I'm standing not on the floor, but behind the screen, just because, especially if we're recording, it's easier for me to speak. So my apologies for not being a little closer to you, but I will encourage questions, especially as we go through some of the material. So a little background on Tillich. To understand his thought, it's helpful to understand who he was, where he comes from. He's born in the mid-1800s in rural Germany. And his mother is more of a artist and liberal person, and his father's more of a conservative German. They kind of, there's kind of, I guess, 2 types of Germans. I suppose there's probably more, but there's 2 major influences of liberalism and kind of conservatism, and Tillich kind of grows up with both of these. And he moves from rural area to, at 14, he moves to Berlin. His father has a new job and he's there. So he has this influence of liberal conservative, not in the typical political ways we think of it, but more just in kind of looking at life kind of ways in the late 1800s, moves from rural to city life. He's ordained a Lutheran minister. So he goes to school and is ordained a Lutheran minister. And in World War I, he serves as a chaplain. And he becomes especially inspired by the world of art. And so even as he's ministering, he is also getting more deep into the world of art and influences of art. These days, we call Tillich a socialist, but not in the not slander, that's not the way I mean to say it, not in the critical way that people say, oh, you're a socialist, but in the way of he believed that separation of class and economy was contrary to the gospel. So especially support for those in the margins, where was his idea of socialist thought. It comes in theology, not political terms. He saw, in his opinion, that the church seemed too often aligned with rulers and not the people. So that's where it comes from, okay? He's condemned by the National Socialist Party, which Hitler rises to power. His party he's kind of kicked out by them. So even though he's kind of a socialist in theology, he is not a member of the Socialist Party and is actually rejected by them. So that just tells you that we have to be careful about labeling and what we think these labels mean, because there's a big disparity there. So he was a university professor at the time in the early 30s, and because of Hitler's government comes to power, he is kicked out of his post. So now he is an educator or a theologian without a teaching job. So he's approached by some friends, the Niebuhr brothers, who are at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and they tell him he should come and teach at Union Theological Seminary and Columbia University. So he comes from Germany to the U.S. in the mid-30s. He begins teaching here. He ends up teaching not only at Columbia and Union, but then he ends up teaching at Harvard and then Chicago Theological as well. So he's involved in some major places in the 50s. This is he's contemporary and cohort of the Niebuhrs. He would have crossed paths with Dietrich Bonhoeffer until Bonhoeffer left Union and went back to Germany in the middle of really dangerous times. But they would have all crossed paths around this time, if any of those names mean anything to you. And Tillich is especially interested and concerned with theology and culture. So he has Kierkegaard as an influence. He's interested in what I learned in seminary is public theology. So not just theology in its own concept, but how does it apply in society? And for that, I can see how that has a major impact on theology and the church in the 50s and 60s. When you think about the rise of civil rights movement and all these kind of different interactions that society, the church and the culture, the kind of there's a rise of you give birth to Woodstock and then the counterculture, but then the counter to the counterculture and all those different things that the church is trying to figure out its place and within the culture. That makes me think, yeah, Tillich definitely there's a place for that at that time period in our history that is needed for theology to speak to culture. He reflects on his contemporaries dealing with existentialism, which is the problem of human existence, and he does it from a theological perspective. So a little bit differently than some of the others who do it just kind of in its own kind of thing. He's always concerned about how to think about existence within a framework of being created in goodness. And Paul Tillich eventually dies in 1965. So his most popular and most, he kind of really gets rolling on publishing and really writing in the last 20 years of his life. So he really starts producing, which makes sense. I mean, it takes a little, it takes time, it takes experience before you're ready to actually offer those things to others. So it makes sense that his most popular and most enduring thought comes kind of later in his career. Including, as I said, a 3-volume systematic theology that had a major impact and was used as a seminary textbook for many years, for many seminaries. So, a little bit about now his essay, You Are Accepted. This essay, it revolves around Paul's, Romans chapter 5, verse 20, Paul's statement, moreover, the law is entered and that offense might abound, but where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. This is a passage that's been preached on, well, the Bible has been, but especially this passage has been wrestled with for many centuries. In the early church, St. Augustine, he comes to Christian life later in his life, and he admits that he was a sinner, and the quote often attributed to him is sin and sin boldly. It comes from this, where the law abounds and where sin abounds, grace much more abounds. The idea that you shouldn't go around sinning boldly, but that grace always can overrule that sin. But we're not here to talk about Augustine and a brief and oversimplification of some of his work, but rather Tillich. So Tillich needs to, he writes this in about 1948. So he's in the latter part of his career. He's in his 60s. He's going to pass away around the age of 80. And he first tries to help us understand. He wrestles with sin and grace, which theologians, good and bad ones, all of us, should wrestle with sin and grace at some point. I remember early in my career when I'd do a call to confession, I would say we must examine ourselves and, how we fall short. And the pastor I was working with finally said, Chris, sometimes you just need to say the word sin. Like, examine ourselves for what? Like, he's like, are you a dermatologist? And I said, yeah, we must examine our sin. And it's important to name that, but it feels like judgmental sometimes to say that word, We're judging ourselves, we're judging others. So Tillich immediately puts that a little bit to rest, and he says, there's no thing as plural of sin. In other words, he says it shouldn't be plural because we are not talking about acts that we commit or that we omit. So a little sin here, a big sin there. That Paul's saying, Tillich is saying, no, sin is sin. And he tries to help us understand that when we talk about sins, we try and manipulate the concept of sin. We start to try and control the concept of sin. We can cast blame on others for their sins. We can blame ourselves for ours. We can also figure out how to be righteous by, I used to do that, but now I don't do that anymore, so that sin is taken care of. And Tillich is trying to challenge us to say, that's not the way sin works. It's not a bunch of acts. In other words, because if you do that, you can eliminate sin and become self-righteous, righteous by self. And this is not a biblical perspective, Tillich would argue, of sin. Sin is a condition, not an act. So Tillich equates sin very firmly with the concept of separation. And as I think about that, I don't know if my father ever said those words to me, but when I think of sin, that's exactly what I think of. Because when people ask me, do you think hell is a real place? I say, well, I'm not going to argue semantics with you, but I will tell you that I believe in loneliness and isolation and separation. And whether that's a physical reality or a spiritual one, I know that hell is a place because I know what it's like to be lonely and I know what it feels like to be separate. And I know that is suffering and division and everything that is not God. And so when I hear Tillich name it, sin is separation, to me that says that is everything I believe about sin. It is separation. And he argues separation in 3 points: with ourselves, with others, and with what he calls the ground of being, which is his way of describing God's kind of how we're created to be. He's not saying the ground of being is another name for the divine. He's trying to help us understand that's our purpose, our plan, everything in life is a ground for being. And so he calls it, it's not too far a step then to think about it as guilt, right? So we know we're separated for something we should belong to. And when we actively participate in that separation, then all of a sudden we start to feel guilty. It brings guilt. So it becomes our existence. So then Tillich says before it becomes an act, then it's already our existence. Because we're separated from it, we know it, and we participate in it, so we know that is just our state. So if nothing else, I challenge you to think about what it means to call sin singular and collective. Well, those are not the same thing. Sin collective and not plural. So in other words, to talk about sin as a condition, not a bunch of acts. So then Tillich counters sin or presents another part of what grace is. And he says that it goes along with his understanding of sin and separation, is that you can't understand grace unless you understand sin. Because unless you can understand separation, you don't really understand reconciliation, right? Or unity, which Tillich argues is grace. So some divine it as a divine king willing to forgive over and over. This is grace. Oh, God is gracious. God forgives us over and over and over. Tillich says, no, that's not what grace is. Some say it's benevolence in the face of cruelty and the destructiveness of in life. So even in the face of all of this, you offer grace. Tillich says that's not it either. That's not what grace is being forgiving even when it hurts, right? Some say that grace is when we have a gifts that we can use positively to impact the world. God's grace. But Tillich says, no, that's not it either, because in grace, something has to be overcome. A separateness has to be overcome to be unified, to bring into reconciliation. That is what grace is. Sin is separateness. Grace brings unity. So grace occurs in spite of separation and estrangement. And it's a reunion of life with life. It can be a reconciliation of ourselves with ourselves, and an acceptance of that which is rejected. So Tillich, after understanding, or at least giving his understanding of what sin and what grace are, then talks about separation and reunion, sin and grace. It's the idea of how in the middle of a party you can be lonely. So you can see all this activity around you, all of this unity around you, you can feel separate from it. You can feel isolated in the midst of people. How's that possible? But it's true, right? We all have felt that in a big group when we felt alone, even amongst people. There's a hidden hostility in us that Tillich would say. He references Kant that there's something in the misfortune of our best friends that does not displease us. So even when bad things happen to our best friends, somehow that doesn't make us feel terrible sometimes. There's a hostility. We knock people down instead of building each other up. I talked about it today, just so happened, in doing justice, loving kindness, walking in humility with God. We wouldn't need to hear those things if we were predisposed to doing all those things. And instead, there's something about us that's in conflict. Right? We're almost always ready to abuse others, as refined as it might be, for self-evaluation. So I had a friend in college that always told me, whenever we'd go out and he'd want a wingman, he'd always say, hey, remember, we build each other up, we don't break each other down. In other words, you make me look good by complimenting me. You don't make me look good by me saying how much better I am than you. So in other words, you don't try and put someone else down to elevate yourself. You bring other people up, and that makes you elevated too, right? But that's not our tendency. It shows up, Tillich argues, and this is like, wow, he's writing this, just after World War II, but he's writing this 70 years ago. And we just think about, oh my gosh, like it must be true because it's still true today. When people ask me, are there still prophets in our world today? I say, look at this. Because I know exactly who he was talking to then and how much more does it apply today. Walls of distance are being removed by technology, Tillich argues. In 1948, he's arguing this. But estrangement between heart and heart continued to be strengthened even as those walls break down. We have the knowledge of suffering, yet sin and separation allows us to live as if we're ignorant. In other words, you could know that there's disease and famine in another country somewhere in the world, and you could still sleep at night, saying, well, that's not my thing, right? Estrangement prevails. We're separated from ourselves. Self-love is good, and selfishness and self-hate pursue us. Loving yourself allows you to love one another, Tillich argues, but hate and despair, self-contempt, it just continues to come around us. And we have an instinct towards self-destruction. So then he talks about Paul. Paul writes, I do not do the good I desire, but the evil I do not. The Apostle Paul writes, not Paul Tillich. And it's so true. How many times have we thought, like, why did I just do that? I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do the other thing. It could be the simplest, stupidest thing. Like, I just ate a bunch of sweets when I know I'm on a diet. Why did I do that? I'm just going to feel rotten about myself. I should go for a walk. No, I'm just going to sit here and read a book. Well, that's nice. But then later on today, I think, man, I wasted the day. Now it's dark. I could read a book now. I can't go for a walk anymore. Why didn't I just do it when I had the chance? These little things, these are just meaningless things, right? But they're just the one little example. We know there's such a common occurrence in our lives where we do the things that we don't want to do, that we know we shouldn't do. Those are the things that attract us to doing them, right? And we're separated from our ground of being, which is Tillich's way of talking about God and God's creation. We end up not knowing where we've come from or where we're going. We're separated from the mystery, depth, and greatness of our existence. We lose that we lose that connection with the mystery of God. I loved Nancy's talk about the Chrismons today and talking about symbols and mystery. And I just think, that's such a big part of things, right? And we can feel called, but we feel resistance to those callings that we know are there in our lives. So Tillich writes that we can't escape the ultimate depth of sin. The paradox is that we're separated even as we're bound. We're estranged even as we belong to sin, and we're destroyed and yet preserved in this separation. It leads to despair because you can't break away. You're bound in separation, which is the weirdest thing to say, right? You get bound by isolation, which is, how does that happen? But then we can't escape it. It brings despair. And you want to talk about, boy, when I hear and when I look at what's going on, especially with kids and in our country, we have so much despair that people say, oh, well, the job market isn't what it once was. It's not that. It's this. Even as people are connected to the utmost, they're isolated and made to feel separate. And so the more you seek connection, the more you feel isolated. And it just leads to despair. How can it not, right? So Tillich writes that in Christ, we are accepted in spite of our rejection. And that is an incredible thing. And grace comes in not as a sudden belief. He talks about being struck by grace and how, some people are, this happened. And Tillich's like, no, it's not a sudden belief or making progress in self-control. Oh, I've grown in grace, Moral progress can prevent us from receiving grace, Tillich says, which I myself have said, you can't understand grace unless you understand you need grace. So I get it, right? Not that I'm the one who understands, but you don't know forgiveness unless you know you need to be forgiven for something. And Tillich says, better to refuse Jesus than to accept Jesus without the concept of grace. So better just to refuse Jesus than to accept Jesus and not really understand the concept of grace. And this is where his essay's title comes from. He says, when you are struck by grace, it is if we hear a voice saying, you are accepted. You are accepted by that which is greater than you, the name of which you do not know. Do not ask for the name now, perhaps you'll find it later. Do not try anything new, perhaps later you will do much. Do not seek for anything, do not perform anything, do not intend anything. Simply accept the fact that you are accepted. Nothing is demanded but acceptance. And in that, grace can transform. And then Tillich goes on to say that once grace has struck at us in that way, once we've understood that we're accepted, we can understand not only the words of others better, but sometimes the intent behind those words, sometimes the hurt behind words. It allows you to take somebody who's having a bad day and offers really nasty things to you to understand that wasn't about me at all. That was about something else. And to allow you not to hold it against that person or hold it against yourself. It's those kind of things that I'm just using my own life as an example. That happens. And it's hard sometimes to take the brunt of somebody who's having a bad day or having a bad week or having a bad month or having a bad year. And it's hard when somebody who has a quarrel with God takes it out on you. But when you understand we're accepted, and when we understand that grace that brings unity, it enables us to do those kind of things. We have moments of accepting ourselves because we feel we've been accepted by that which is greater than we. We cannot compel it, but sometimes we have the power to say yes to ourselves. We can be made whole. We can know peace. Self-hatred and contempt can disappear. Self is united with self. Grace comes upon us. Tillich argues, sin and grace abound, may grace abound even more. So, it's a heck of an essay. It's a heck of a sermon. It's a heck of a passage to live by. It deals with two of Paul's most confusing but honest statements. Where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. What is that all about? And I do the thing not that I want to do, but that which I do not want to do. And when you think about those things and what impact they have on us, there it is. They're right. Tillich really gets to the meat of it. So I think it was Chris Allgaier who told me that she's read this like a number of times, because even though it's just 4 pages, it is so packed with dense concepts that aren't really hard to understand. They just come at you like a flood with everything that's coming. So you can wrestle with this essay for a month as you read and reread it. It's a wonderful, compact essay. And for me, as I read it, it inspires me, because I think, especially right now, this is gospel to our world, to people who don't know Jesus, to people who think they know Jesus, to people who just are everywhere. Sin abounds, where we're told to be in conflict, where we're told that there's right and wrong. Yeah, there's right and wrong. Don't get me wrong. I'm not being relative. But blame is not the answer. That is sin abounding. And there's no way that blame is ever going to lead to reconciliation. And so if we look at what Tillich is saying, and we say that the ultimate goal is grace and unity, what are we doing to combat the sin that's among us? Figuring out who did it is contrary to what sin is, Tillich argues, because it's not an act, it's a condition. So if we're ever going to overcome that condition, how do we figure out how to overcome that condition? So that's my pitch to you. Does anybody have any questions? I don't know that I can answer them. Like I said, I don't claim to be a Tillich expert. I really just wanted to talk a little bit about who he was and this particular essay. So I'm looking forward to getting to know Tillich a bit more and to understand more about Tillich. But I know some of you who maybe took philosophy or theology classes in your studies may have studied Tillich in ways that I didn't by the time I was in seminary or philosophy, in my time in college and seminary. But does anybody have any questions that I might be able to answer or deal with? Ginny?
There was a phrase that I did not understand. On page 2, grace is just as difficult to describe as sin. For some people, grace is the willingness of the divine King and Father to forgive us over and over again, the foolish and weakness of the subjects and children. I would say that's my most frequent view of grace, which is not why not to accept. Then it says, we must reject such a concept of grace, for it is a merely childish destruction of a human dignity. I can't make head or tail of that phrase.
So Ginny talks about this concept of grace as the willingness of a divine king to forgive over and over, and how that's made for a lot of decent sermons, to be honest. But and then if we don't reject that concept, Tillich writes, it's merely childish destruction of a human dignity. I think what he's saying, Ginny, is that concept of grace always puts us in the position of the sinner. And it always focuses on our acts that need to be forgiven. It doesn't get to anything about reconciliation and condition of separateness and bringing together. Because if we resort too much to children and parents. Who needs to be forgiven? It's the child who did something wrong. We know that as children. We remember what we did wrong and when we needed to be forgiven. on the schoolyard at home. And we remember as parents, if we've been parents or just people around other people, that when you're in the position to forgive, you're always above somebody who needs the forgiveness, right? I'm not saying that's always the case, but that's what Tillich is speaking against. When we consider grace always as the divine king forgiving us over and over, we have to always go to the divine king saying, I'm bad, I forgive you, I did all these things. And that goes against what he's saying. Sin is not a bunch of acts. It's a condition of separateness, and grace is unity.
Saying that it is a merely childish destruction of human dignity, is he saying when you treat grace as forgiveness for this act, it diminishes the human dignity of what grace really is? Is that what it's saying?
I think that's what he's saying, is that when you treat grace as just forgiveness of one act or another, it diminishes dignity in that it doesn't leave us open for true reconciliation if grace is always just forgiveness of what we do wrong.
Right. In other words, it doesn't lead us to the goal.
Where does it lead? Exactly, Jenny. Where does it lead us? It just keeps us trapped in that cycle. It's wonderful to feel that forgiveness, don't get me wrong. But unless we can ultimately feel reconciled, unless we know that's the ultimate goal, then it just leaves us in that cycle of forgiveness, of sin and forgiveness. Sin's acts. It's a lot bigger than just that. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a state or condition.
Right.
I was just going to make one other comment, and that is when Paul says, do the things I ought not to do and don't do the things I ought to do. In psychology, they use the discussion of superego, ego, and id. And there's a lot of conflict with this.
The psychology.
Ego is dealing with a lot of conflict between the superego and the id all the time.
So for those at home who might not have heard that question or statement, Jenny was talking about the idea of Paul's statement about doing the thing you don't want to do, and superego and id and those psychology concepts that absolutely are part of that. It's examining the same problem from a different way, right? Without the
Ego is
yeah.
yourself, your aware self trying to deal with.
Your ego trying to deal with all of that. Yeah. Chris, I think you had a question.
Yes. Does Tillich believe that the human condition moves between sin and grace and sin? Are you always in a state of sin or always in a state of grace, or do you move between those two?
So Chris asked me to make a declarative statement on what Tillich believes. Well, I know you're really not asking me to do that, Chris, but you said, does Tillich believe? And I am always scared to say what some guy who passed away before I even was born, what he believes, right? But I say that with a sarcastic kind of caveat, right? But Chris's question, does Tillich then seem to presume that we are moving always between a state of sin and a state of grace, like we can move between the two? I would say, Chris, that it's important to take the word state out and put the word condition in.
Okay.
So when you're between one state and another, it makes me think of water, a state of liquid and a state of solid. It's defined. But when you're in a condition, you could be in a condition of mental health and physical illness. Those things can coexist in the same condition. So I think that Tillich would argue that sin and grace abound. May grace abound much more. We are in a condition of sin and a condition of grace. Those things can be true at the same time. We do not move from one to another. We experience them. Go ahead, sorry.
That's okay. And I'm new to the Reformed Church, so does the Reformed Church believe that you are born in a state of sin?
Does the Reformed Church believe that you are born in a state of sin? So what we call original sin, maybe. The Reformed tradition would claim that we are totally depraved. the idea of total depravity is that even at our best, we still are not fully living the lives that God wants for us to live. Because we can't ever eliminate the acts of sin, but we are in a condition of sin. And because of that, people don't like that word, total depravity. I think that the human condition is ultimately good. Okay, that's fine. But it's not saying that you're totally bad. It's saying that even at your best, you're not what God desires and plans for us to be, what God created us to be. So yes, the Reformed tradition falls squarely in the idea that we live in a sinful condition and that we do not have the power to overcome that condition ourselves.
And is that what Tillich is referring to as separation?
I believe so. I think it's two ways. Is that what Tillich is saying when he talks about separation? I believe it's two ways of saying the same essential concept. That no matter what, there's still separation there. No matter how hard we work at it, no matter how good we might be. I did everything good this week. I wasn't bad at all. I did my diet. I was nice to my neighbor, even the person on the other side of my house whose dog sometimes goes on my lawn. I was nice to them. I did everything right this week. I gave at church. I went to church. I did everything. Tillich is saying that's not the point. The point is not a list of things. And he gets at, something that's pretty basic concept of Christian life, is that Christian living isn't a bunch of rules. But when you understand the concepts of total depravity, or understanding the concepts of a condition of sin, all of a sudden you think, oh yeah, that's why grace is important. Because if you can do it without those things, you don't need the grace.
And that goes back to your sermon this morning in Micah, that asking, what do I do to please God? What is your price, God?
So thanks for, I told Chris to please bring it to a close by wrapping it up by referring to things I said earlier today. I paid her good money to do this, so I'm glad that she did it at the end of the thing. This goes back to my sermon this morning. In fact, it does. So yes, the people asking God saying, you keep asking, what do you want from us, God? And then, burnt offerings, you want 10,000 rivers of oil, you want our firstborn. And it's, again, that's sin as acts. We need to atone for this act and this act and this act and this act. No. It's reconciliation. It's doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with your... Doing justice is reconciliation with others. Loving kindness, reconciliation with yourself. And walking in humility with the Lord. That's reconciliation to God. We just got all three major points of what Paul Tillich is saying. So Chris, thank you for putting a bow on all of that. I could not have done it better myself. So with that, we'll conclude. Thank you, Paul, for taping, and thanks everybody for being here. If you have more questions or you want to borrow a book, please, by all means.